Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast thematic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the legacy of Gandhi and the making of modern-day India. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and to scroll down the correct section and get ready to answer the key comprehension questions that coincide with the reading. Please remember that you can play any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. The introduction. The legacy of Gandhi. October marks the 150th birthday of a man who stood up to the British Empire and helped give birth to modern India and Pakistan. He was a frail man who wore glasses and traditional Hindu loincloth called a dhoti, and walked with a bamboo staff, and had a toothless grin. He looked like a simple Hindu holy man, but armed only with a great courage and a strong commitment to nonviolent resistance. Mohandas Gandhi took one of the world's mightiest empires. For nearly 30 years, Gandhi led the movement that eventually forced Britain to grant independence to India, its most prized colony. In 1947, the subcontinent was partitioned or divided into two nations, India and Pakistan. In October, celebrations will ring out across India in honor of the 150th birthday of Gandhi, known as the father of the nation. Today, India is the world's largest democracy, and it is the fifth largest economy in the world too, according to the International Monetary Fund. However, tensions have recently risen between the nation's Hindu majority and its Muslim minority, as well as between India and Pakistan. And many experts believe the region is moving away from the ideals for which Gandhi had fought for. Yet Gandhi is still revered worldwide, not only for helping liberate the Indian subcontinent from British imperialism, but for his nonviolent protests, which inspired many other civil rights movements, including the one led by Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. Gandhi envisioned a world of neighborliness and openness to strangers, says Gyan Prakash, a history professor at the Princeton University and the author of numerous books of India. The message Gandhi stood for was that public service or politics was not just about power, but about something larger. Next section. Gandhi's rise. Gandhi, born on October 2, 1869 in Western India, never expected to face a movement. But his moment of truth, when he decided that he would dedicate his life to fighting injustice, came in 1893. When he was just 24 years old, after graduating from law school, he'd been hired to work as a lawyer for an Indian trader in South Africa. Riding the train there one day was a first-class ticket. Gandhi was asked to move to a third-class car to make room for a white passenger. When he refused, he was thrown off the train. The incident opened Gandhi's eyes to the discrimination against non-whites that was common in South Africa, which at the time was split between British and Dutch rule. More than 150,000 Indians had been brought there as indentured servants, and in certain provinces they were forbidden to their own property and vote in local elections, and they had to register with the government and have their fingerprints taken. Gandhi spent 21 years fighting these injustices, and during this time he developed his philosophy of nonviolence, that the only way to bring about change was through peaceful demonstrations such as boycotts, marches, and sit-ins. The first principle of nonviolent action, he wrote, is that of non-cooperation with everything humiliating. After negotiating the repeal of some of South Africa's most oppressive laws targeting Indians, Gandhi brought his method of nonviolent action back to India. Next section. British India. India had been under British rule dating back to 1757, when an army assembled by Great Britain's East India Company, a group of British investors who wanted to trade with India, defeated the governor of Bengal in the battle near Calcutta. This private company, with its own troops and powers of taxation, soon became the dominant force of a subcontinent of 400 million people. It was brutal and often racist overseer whose indifference helped create and exacerbate famines in India in the late 1700s. A failed uprising by Indian troops led by the British Crown to dissolve East India Company in 1858 and take control of the subcontinent, making an official colony. In 1919, the British passed the Rollout Act, which gave the Raj, as the British administration in India was known, the power to imprison, without trial, anyone who thought to be plotting to overthrow the government. Now, the act was aimed at shutting down opposition from Indian nationalists, but it had the opposite effect. The push for Indian independence intensified, and Gandhi emerged as a national figure. He called for a day of protest in which businesses throughout the country shut down. The British arrested Gandhi and other protest leaders, fueling more demonstrations. At one of them, in Amritsar, British forces fired on the unarmed crowd, killing more than 400 people. The massacre galvanized Indians, and they rallied around Gandhi, calling him Mahatma, or Great Soul in Sanskrit. In 1920, Gandhi organized a campaign of non-cooperation with the British. Indians boycotted British goods, courts, schools, and taxes, bringing the nation to a standstill. Gandhi was unlike other leaders of the independence movement, though, which had been dominated by elites. He believed India would gain independence only through a mass movement that included all Indians, rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim. He rejected modernity, wore simple clothes to identify with the poor, and advocated for the Dalits, which is known as the untouchables, the lowest caste in India's traditional social hierarchy. Next section is the Salt March. Gandhi's most famous act of defiance began on March 12, 1930, when he led a protest against the Salt Acts, which prohibited Indians from gathering, making, or selling their own salt, forcing them instead to buy it from the British. With 78 followers by his side, the 61-year-old Gandhi embarked on a 240-mile walk from his home in Ahmedabad to Dandi, on the shore of the Arabian Sea. At the end of the 24-day journey, known as the Salt March, Gandhi picked up a lump of salt from the mud and proclaimed to a large crowd, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." Gandhi was imprisoned for 7 months, but tens of thousands of Indians followed his example, making salt at the seaside and submitting to beatings and arrests. When World War II began, Gandhi and other Indian leaders decided not to support the war unless Britain, quote, quit India immediately and granted independence to them. Britain refused, and Gandhi began the Quit India movement. The British arrested Gandhi and more than 100,000 others, but the movement helped persuade other countries, including the US, to put pressure on Britain to set India free. After the war, the financially depleted Britain was finally ready to do just that. However, within India, tensions increased between the Hindus and Muslims, as both groups feared being left out of India's new government. In July of 1947, the British Parliament approved the Indian Independence Act, dividing the subcontinent into 2 independent countries. Hindu-dominated India and Muslim-dominated Pakistan. Millions of Hindus soon fled Pakistan for India, as millions of Muslims left India for Pakistan, though many more stayed in India and remain today. More than 10 million people became refugees, and as many as 1 million people were killed in violence between the 2 groups. Gandhi opposed partition. Hindus and Muslims, he said, must be brave enough to love one another, tolerate one another's religion, and trust one another. To protest the violence, he went on hunger strikes and visited troubled areas. It was during one of those visits in 1948 that his life was tragically cut short, and a Hindu extremist upset about Gandhi's tolerance of Muslims shot him 3 times, killing him at age 78. People around the world mourned his loss. Just an old man in loincloth in distant India, the American journalist Louis Fisher wrote, "Yet when he died, humanity wept." And here's the final section. India and Pakistan. Today, the region's Muslim-Hindu divide persists, and many say it's gotten worse with the re-election of India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. In May, Modi has promoted a Hindu nationalist message that has often pitted Hindus against Muslims. Since partition, India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars, 2 over the disputed region of Kashmir, and with both claim both countries are nuclear armed, and they've come close to a nuclear confrontation. Fighting between the 2 countries escalated recently after a suicide bomber from Pakistan-based militant group killed 40 Indian troops in Kashmir in February, in the region's deadliest attack in 3 decades. Prakash of Princeton says that if Gandhi were alive today, he'd be working toward healing these divisions, as well as eliminating inequality and the caste system, both which still hamper India. And Prakash says Gandhi would be doing it the same way he always pursued justice, through dialogue and love, rather than an us versus them struggle. And for clarity, here's a timeline of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. throughout the years to understand the essence of human rights and nonviolence through means of peaceful protest to achieving an agenda. So as you guys can see, Gandhi has left a permanent positive mark on the course of Indian and world history, hence the reason why we have to talk about this in a world cultures class. Only time will tell how India deals with the trials and tribulations of today. Thank you very much for tuning in.